when I started, I saw that the question of the representation of Palestinians seems quite important to study. How are Palestinians represented in Israeli textbooks? And I think the overarching question was, how come Israeli boys and girls who are educated on supposedly very enlightened humanistic values end up being such horrible monsters in the army? And I thought that some of the answer can be found in textbooks, because textbooks are books that students must read for the examination, whether they like it or not. So, and I don't think there are many students that are interested in getting information about history and things like that from other sources. This is not in their interest. So the only thing they know is what they find in textbooks, what they are taught in class. So I thought it would be very interesting to see how Palestinians are represented, and because Israeli students are drafted to the army right after high school. A month after high school, a year after, but right after high school. So they go with this knowledge into the army. And since they never or hardly ever meet Palestinians face to face or speak to them, although they may live 50 to 100 meters from them, this is what they know. I read a lot about the way the third world is represented in other textbooks in the world, in Europe or here, like Indians, First Nations, etc., etc. And I came across the strategies of racist discourse, and what caught my eye was that all these categories really apply to Israeli textbooks. First of all, not to represent them at all. For example, visually, Palestinians are not represented at all in Israeli textbooks. Now, Israeli textbooks are trade books. It's a private industry, so you have a lot of them. They have to be authorized by the ministry, but they are not issued by the ministry. So you have a lot and lots of books. So in all these books, tens of books that I looked at, you cannot find one photograph of a human being who is a Palestinian. And if you think that we have 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinians, not to speak about the Palestinians in the territories, in the occupied territories, who are about 5 million, it's a bit odd. You never see a Palestinian doctor or teacher or child. And the only way they are represented are as the problems and threats Israel considers them to be. For example, as terrorists, so you see face-covered figures, or as primitive farmers. You see farmers behind the primitive plow with oxen, or in racist cartoons that really look like Alibaba sort of cartoons that were drawn by European artists in the 18th or 19th century, which don't represent anybody who really lives in Israel, but wherever they speak about the citizens of the state, of the Arab, what they call the Arab citizens, this is what you see, these images. So they're either refugees, primitive farmers, terrorists, or absent. For example, you can see, I don't know, in a chapter called The Refugee Problem, they show you an over-flooded street in a poor neighborhood with no people, and they tell you this is the Palestinian problem. Or you can see an aerial photograph of some shanty town, and they tell you this is a Palestinian refugee camp. But you never see people, you never see human beings. So this is one thing, not to show them at all. The other thing is to show them or to speak about them as problems. They usually speak about the Palestinian problem, which is quite shuddering, you know, in a Jewish state, when you remember that the Jews were labeled the Jewish problem about 60 years ago. So it's always in a group, it's always as a collective, and it's always as a problem, threat, and even poisonous problem. And all this is part of what is called the categories of racist discourse. This is how racist discourse acts, both visually and verbally. So this is something that really was very surprising to me. then I wanted to see, for example, in maps. So most books, when they show the map of Israel, they don't show the real borders of Israel. They include Palestine in it. They show you what is called the greater land of Israel. If you see, even the names of the books are never in geography, never the state of Israel, but the land of Israel, which is different. So I think we have like 3 generations of students who don't even know what the borders are. And the people who live in the territories, the non-Jews, they are always labeled non-Jews. So this is another racist way to label people as not us, not what they are, but what they are not. And these non-Jews who live in the territories are either presented as foreign labor that's coming into Israel to work, so like from Thailand or China, not people who really live in the place where they live, or they're not represented at all. Some maps tell you, for example, there are population maps in geography textbooks where the whole, what you should call Palestine, is a blank spot, no color, nothing, and they tell you, for this area we have no data. So in a population map, if you have no data, it means there are no people there. And if it's colorless, it means that it is not inhabited. It's waiting to be inhabited, right? Or a map of employment. So you see the Israeli factories and plants in the occupied territories, in the colonies, but you don't see one Palestinian city or one Palestinian factory or one Palestinian institute or whatever, university. All these things are absent. I must say that I studied very profoundly, very deeply, 16 books, all published after the Oslo Agreement. I wanted to see if there was some change. And there was some change in the 90s, but today it's going backwards and backwards and backwards. And the most recent history school books are really, you can say, military manifests. You have no data, you have no maps, you have no numbers, no statistics, just an overall declaration of, look how we killed more of them and they killed less of us, or something like that, you know.